Picture the moment. A council chamber in Addis Ababa, 1893. Ethiopian nobles seated in a semicircle, oil lamps throwing long shadows on the walls. Emperor Menelik II sits at the head of the table, an Italian diplomat's letter in his hand. The letter informs him, politely but firmly, that European governments have been advised to route all communications with Ethiopia through Rome, that Ethiopia is, as far as the civilized world is concerned, an Italian protectorate. Menelik reads the letter aloud. Then he sets it down. His wife, Empress Taytu, reaches across the table, picks up the Italian copy of the Treaty of Wuchale, the document Italy claims made Ethiopia its colony, and tears it in half. Nobody in that room says a word. What Italy had done was elegant, in a cold way. They had written a peace treaty in two languages, Italian and Amharic, and made sure the two versions said different things. The Italian text stated Ethiopia must conduct all foreign affairs through Italy. The Amharic text said Ethiopia may, if it chooses, use Italy as a go-between. One word's difference, two entirely different realities, printed on the same paper, signed by the same men. Italy had already announced to every royal court in Europe that it owned one of the oldest empires on earth. It had drawn the maps accordingly. 3 years after that council chamber, on the morning of March 1st, 1896, Italy would discover what happens when a map collides with the territory it was never honest about. Over 6,000 Italian soldiers would die in a few hours on a rocky hillside in northern Ethiopia. The single most catastrophic defeat of a European colonial army by an African nation in the entire era of empire. The Battle of Adwa. A disaster that began not on a battlefield, but on a piece of paper with two versions of the truth. Menelik II was born in 1844 in Ankober, in the highland kingdom of Shewa, the son of a king who died when the boy was 11. He spent years as a political prisoner of a rival emperor, not in a dungeon, but in the mountain fortress of Magdala, a gilded cage where he was educated, fed well, and watched constantly. He used the time. He read. He observed how power worked. He learned what it meant to be kept dependent on someone stronger's goodwill, and he spent the rest of his life making sure it never happened to him again. By the time he signed the Treaty of Wuchale in 1889, Menelik had already spent a decade playing the European powers against each other with a sophistication that would have been admired in any diplomatic capital from London to Vienna. He understood precisely what the scramble for Africa was. He had watched the British take Egypt, the French take West Africa, the Belgians take the Congo. He had seen how it worked. Europeans arrived with gifts, signed treaties of friendship, and then produced those same treaties 2 years later as legal proof of ownership. The gift became a bill of sale. The friendship became a protectorate. He had no intention of becoming the next example. The context matters here, because Italian ambitions in 1889 were not subtle. Italy had two narrow, impoverished African territories, Eritrea on the Red Sea and a coastal strip of Somalia, and was deeply humiliated by the comparison to Britain and France, who between them controlled half a continent. Prime Minister Crispi told Parliament openly that Italy needed an African empire not just for resources but for national dignity, for proof that the newest major European nation deserved its seat at the table. Ethiopia, sitting wedged between Eritrea to the north and Italian Somalia to the southeast, was the obvious prize. If Italy could take it, it could link its two colonies into one vast East African empire. Italian planners looked at their maps that showed Ethiopia as a largely blank space, its highlands uncharted, its military strength unknown, and concluded the matter was straightforward. So he armed, quietly, patiently, over years. France wanted to limit Italian power in the region. Russia, seeing a fellow Orthodox Christian kingdom in Ethiopia's ancient Coptic church, was happy to help. Both countries sold Menelik weapons, French Gras rifles, Russian Berdan rifles, artillery pieces. By the mid-1890s, Ethiopia had more than 70,000 modern firearms and 5 million rounds of ammunition. Italian intelligence, meanwhile, was reporting back to Rome that Ethiopia was weak, divided by tribal rivalries, and unlikely to field more than a scattered resistance. Italian intelligence was looking at the map it wanted, not the country that existed. Standing beside Menelik through all of it was Taytu, Empress Taytu Batul. Her name means sunshine in Amharic, though Italian diplomats would have chosen a different word, was born into Ethiopian aristocracy, educated in Amharic and Ge'ez, and had spent her adult life watching Europeans arrive in Africa with treaties and depart with kingdoms. She was not suspicious of Italy in a general way. She was suspicious of this specific clause in this specific document written by these specific men. When Menelik received the first Italian letters announcing that European governments had been instructed to route correspondence through Rome, it was Taytu who explained to the council what that meant in plain language. Ethiopia had already been erased. It existed on Italian maps as a colony. The treaty had been the instrument. And Menelik, cautious, calculating, still weighing the cost of war, had not yet decided what to do about it. Taytu decided for him. She picked up the Italian copy of the treaty and tore it apart. The conversation about accommodation ended there. Menelik announced in 1893, in terms that left no room for interpretation, "My kingdom is an independent kingdom. I seek no one's protection." Italy, certain it could settle the matter with bayonets, began moving troops south from Eritrea into the Ethiopian highlands. It was a miscalculation built on a foundation of smaller miscalculations, and the foundation had started with one document, signed 4 years earlier, in a small town whose name most Italians couldn't pronounce. The Treaty of Wuchale had looked reasonable on its surface. Italy recognized Menelik as emperor. Italy provided loans, weapons, diplomatic cover. Ethiopia recognized Italian control of Eritrea. In exchange for the northern highlands Italy had already occupied, Menelik received 30,000 rifles, 28 artillery cannons, and 4 million lire. A transaction? Both sides signed. But Article 17 had been written with specific care. The Italian text stated that Ethiopia consente di servirsi, agrees to avail itself of, the Italian government for all foreign affairs. The Amharic text used the word yichalal, may, is able to, has the option to. In Italian, an obligation. In Amharic, a courtesy. Italy sent letters to every European capital the same week, announcing that Ethiopia was now its protectorate. When Menelik's own coronation letters arrived directly in London, Paris, and Berlin, bypassing Rome entirely, several governments replied with polite regret that they'd been informed to deal through Italian channels. Ethiopia had been redrawn as Italian territory before a single Italian soldier crossed the Mirab River. This is what Taytu had seen. This is why she tore the paper. General Oreste Baratieri had been governor of Eritrea since 1892, and by 1895 he had made himself a national hero. A former Garibaldian, one of the legendary volunteers who had helped unify Italy, Baratieri was energetic, ambitious, and genuinely capable. He had pushed Italian territory deeper into the Ethiopian highlands through a series of successful small engagements, and Rome had celebrated him for it. Newspapers published his portrait. Children were named after him. He had promised to bring Emperor Menelik back to Italy in a cage, and nobody in Rome thought it an empty boast. By the autumn of 1895, Baratieri had begun to have doubts. His intelligence network was giving him contradictory information. Reports of scattered Ethiopian forces, a divided command, an army without cohesion. These were the dispatches Rome wanted, and they arrived regularly. But Baratieri was a professional, and what he was hearing from his own scouts on the ground was something different. An enormous Ethiopian army was assembling north of Addis Ababa. Numbers that made no sense if you believed the official assessments. Menelik's mobilization proclamation had gone out in September 1895, and the response had been extraordinary. Regional princes arriving with forces of 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 men. The Ethiopian army was not the scattered tribal resistance his briefings had described. It was beginning to look like the largest military force on the African continent. Baratieri also had the maps, or rather he had what passed for maps in 1895 Ethiopia. Charts compiled from incomplete surveys, second-hand explorer accounts, and the confident assumptions of cartographers who had never walked the ground they were drawing. Britannica records it bluntly. The Italian command faced a lack of reliable maps. The highlands north of Adwa, where the campaign would be decided, were represented on paper as a series of manageable ridges and valleys. The actual terrain was something else. Deep ravines hidden behind false crests, tracks that split and disappeared, ground that changed character in the dark in ways no chart had captured. Baratieri's instinct, by February 1896, was to wait. Menelik's massive army was living off the land around Adwa, and the land was running out. Give it another week, perhaps two, and the Ethiopian forces would begin to melt away from simple hunger. The tactical position would resolve itself without battle. It was sound military judgment. Then the telegram arrived. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi had staked his political career on an African empire, and by February 1896 his career was collapsing. Other colonial ventures had gone badly. Parliamentary opposition was growing. He needed a victory, and he needed it immediately. On February 25th, his telegram reached Baratieri. It accused the general of conducting a military phthisis, a consumption, a slow wasting away. It implied cowardice. It demanded action, the kind of action that could rescue an Italian government in crisis and restore national prestige. Baratieri read the telegram and called his generals together that evening. Around the table sat his four brigadiers, Matteo Albertone, Giuseppe Arimondi, Vittorio da Bormida, and Giuseppe Elena. Most argued for attack. Da Bormida, blunt, proud, a career soldier who had never retreated from anything, said explicitly that Italy would rather lose thousands of men in battle than pull back in disgrace. Baratieri looked at the faces around the table. He looked at Crispi's telegram. He thought about the maps, and the scouts' reports he wasn't supposed to believe, and the numbers that didn't add up. Then he gave the order to advance. 3 brigades, midnight, into the dark. It was a plan built on maps that couldn't be trusted, against an enemy that had been systematically misrepresented, pushed by a government that needed a headline more than a strategy. Baratieri knew at least 2 of those things. He advanced anyway. Midnight, February 29th, 1896. 3 Italian columns began to move. Baratieri's plan was geometrically clean. Albertone's brigade, 4 battalions of Eritrean askari led by Italian officers, 14 artillery pieces, roughly 4,000 men, would take the left and advance to a peak called Kidane Merit. Arimondi would take the center, Da Bormida the right. If the columns stayed in contact and maintained pace, they would arrive at their assigned ridges together at first light, forming an interlocking line of fire that would be formidable even against a much larger force. The plan assumed the columns could see each other, communicate easily, and follow the map to their positions in the dark. None of those assumptions survived contact with the actual ground. The Ethiopian highlands at midnight are not the highlands on a European survey map. The tracks the columns were following split unexpectedly, rejoined, split again. Ravines appeared where the map showed open ground. Ridges that looked parallel on paper ran at angles that gradually separated the brigades from each other. Albertone's column moved fast. He had Eritrean soldiers who could march, and he was eager. By 2 or 3 in the morning, he was miles ahead of Arimondi, miles away from Da Bormida, deep into terrain that the map had represented as a straightforward advance to high ground. Somewhere in the darkness, Albertone consulted his chart and made a decision. He had reached what he believed was Kidane Merit, his position, his assigned objective. He halted his column, set his artillery, and waited for the sun. When the sun came up, he found himself not on the high ground overlooking the valley, but forward of it, lower, exposed, with slopes rising around him on multiple sides. The peak shown on the map and the peak he was standing on were not the same. He had marched 4,000 men and 14 artillery pieces into a bowl, when word reached Menelik that the Italian columns were moving. The emperor had already been awake for hours. He rose before dawn for prayers. It was the first day of March, a religious holiday, and his soldiers had been told the Italians were resting. They were not resting. His chief intelligence officer, Ras Alula, a man who had been fighting wars in this terrain for 30 years, who knew every ridge and ravine between here and Eritrea, had kept scouts on the Italian positions through the night. The reports came in before sunrise. 3 columns, separated, miles between them, each one moving toward a different piece of ground, none of them able to see the others. Menelik turned to Taytu. Then he ordered his forces forward. The Ethiopian command structure at Adwa was itself a work of strategic art. Ras Makhonen, father of the future Emperor Haile Selassie, commanded a force of 12,000. Ras Mikhael led several thousand Oromo cavalry. Negus Teklehamenot commanded the right wing, Ras Alula the left. Menelik himself held 25,000 Shoan Imperial Guard in reserve to be committed only at the decisive moment. Taytu's personal force, 5,000 men and artillery, was positioned to cover the Ethiopian flank. The whole structure was coordinated, sequenced, designed to hit isolated Italian units in sequence before they could support each other, which is exactly what they did. At 6 in the morning, the first wave hit Albertoni. His askari held. For 2 hours, which is a very long time when you are isolated and outnumbered and men are dying around you, the Eritrean soldiers fought back with discipline and courage. Their artillery fired into the charging Ethiopian lines, dropping men by the hundreds. The Ethiopians came again. The askari fired again. Albertoni sent messengers to Aramondi. He needed support immediately. The messengers found Aramondi's column still navigating toward its assigned position, the gap between the two brigades much larger than anyone had anticipated. The support didn't come. Albertoni's line finally broke under the weight of numbers it was never designed to withstand. The general himself was pulled from his horse and taken prisoner. The askari survivors streamed back toward Aramondi, carrying their panic with them. Ethiopian forces surged through the gap where Albertone's position had been, pressing toward the center. Arimondi's Italian brigade caught the flood of retreating askari and tried to hold a line. Elite bersaglieri, light infantry, among the finest soldiers Italy had, planted themselves on a hillside and traded volleys with an Ethiopian force that had the high ground and was growing larger by the minute. They held for 3 hours. Then Menelik released the imperial reserve. 25,000 Shoan soldiers came down the slope. The center collapsed. On the right, Dabramida had been fighting his own isolated battle all morning. His brigade had beaten back several Ethiopian attacks and, cut off from any news of the other columns, believed itself to be doing well. Around midday, Dabramida finally understood he was the only intact Italian formation on the field. He ordered a retreat toward the Italian lines. His column moved back through a narrow valley that the map had shown as a clear passage. The Ethiopians were already in the valley. They had been waiting. Ethiopian lancers came in from both ends. Infantry came down the slopes. Dabramida's column, trying to retreat through ground it didn't know, was cut apart in the confined space. Dabramida was killed somewhere in that valley. Exactly where and exactly how, nobody ever established with certainty. His body was never found. By noon, it was over. The Italian army that had marched out the night before, 17,000 soldiers, 56 artillery pieces, the pride of a nation that had dreamed of empire, was gone. The survivors were running for Eritrea across terrain they still didn't know, abandoning their wounded, their artillery, 11,000 rifles, and every supply wagon on the hillsides of Adwa. Baratieri, who had ordered the advance, now ordered the retreat. He sent his last message to Rome at 9 the following morning from a town 40 miles away. The numbers were not the numbers of a battle. They were the numbers of a slaughter. More than 6,000 Italian soldiers killed, 261 officers among them, nearly 3,000 Italian rank and file, around 1,000 askari dead, another 1,800 wounded, nearly 4,000 taken prisoner. The Italian government's official count later put the dead at over 6,000. Some estimates, counting those who died of wounds in the weeks following, ran higher. In Rome, the news arrived like a physical blow. Crispi, the man who had sent the telegram demanding action, who had made Italian prestige in Africa his personal project, resigned within days. His government fell apart. There were street riots. Universities and theaters in Rome closed to prevent the crowds from turning violent. Baratieri was put on military trial, though he was eventually acquitted. Newspapers that had printed his portrait now printed cartoons of national humiliation. The cage he had promised to bring Menelik back in became a symbol of everything Italy had gotten wrong about Africa. What Italy had gotten wrong was everything. It had been wrong about Menelik, not a chieftain managing a disorganized tribal force, but a man who had spent 7 years preparing this exact defense, who had bought the guns and trained the soldiers and played France against Russia against Britain to keep the weapons flowing. It had been wrong about Taytu, filing her away as a consort, a ceremonial presence, when she had designed the strategy that won Mekil and driven every major decision about whether to fight. It had been wrong about the army. 70,000 modern rifles, experienced commanders, men who had grown up on this ground and could move through it in the dark. And it had been wrong about the ground itself. It had drawn ridges that didn't exist, omitted ravines that did, handed those charts to 3 generals, and told them to navigate by moonlight. The lie in Article 17 had required other lies to survive. Ethiopia was a protectorate, so Ethiopia had to be weak. The terrain was manageable, so the maps had to be accurate. Menelik was beatable, so the intelligence had to be wrong. Each lie propped up the last one. By midnight on February 29th, the entire Italian army was marching through darkness, guided by a picture of the world that had never been true. Menelik did not march into Eritrea. He could have. His army was intact, supplied with captured Italian weapons and artillery, and the Eritrean colony was in no state to resist. But Menelik understood what pursuing the Italians into their coastal colony would mean. It would turn a colonial defeat into a European crisis, and the other powers would respond. Britain, France, Germany were watching Adwa with something close to horror, and the last thing any of them wanted was the precedent of an African emperor dismantling European Africa. Menelik's goal had never been conquest, it had been survival. Ethiopian independence, recognized and guaranteed. He got it. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in October 1896, formally abrogated the Treaty of Wuchale. Italy acknowledged Ethiopian sovereignty without conditions. Every European power, one by one, sent delegations to negotiate borders with this newly proven nation, not as administrators managing an African territory, but as diplomats recognizing a sovereign state that had just taught the world something it hadn't expected to learn. For the Ethiopian prisoners of war, the Italian officers held in Addis Ababa, the aftermath was surprisingly dignified. General Albertone, the man who had marched his column into the bowl in the dark, was given a tent, a horse, and servants. He was treated, in Menelik's telling phrase, as a guest. The Eritrean askari who had fought under Italian command were treated differently. By Ethiopian tradition, soldiers captured fighting for an enemy had their right hands and left feet amputated to prevent them from ever fighting again. An observer who visited the battlefield months later recorded a rotting pile of severed hands and feet near the streams. The horror of it should not be softened. The impact of Adwa traveled far beyond Ethiopia. In the American South, in the Caribbean, in African communities scattered across the globe, black newspapers and religious networks carried the news. An African nation had defeated a European army. Not through luck, not through a fluke, but through strategy, preparation, and the decision of one emperor and one empress that their country was worth fighting for. Adwa became a founding image of Pan-Africanism, evidence that the supposedly natural order of European dominance was not natural at all. It was a political construction, and constructions could be demolished. 40 years later, Mussolini sent a vastly larger Italian force back to finish what 1896 had started, this time with poison gas, aerial bombardment, and 500,000 soldiers. This time, Italy occupied Ethiopia for 5 years, until the Second World War drove it out. That invasion in 1935 was understood by everyone involved as revenge for Adwa. The defeat had burned itself so deeply into Italian national memory that it took 4 decades and a fascist government to attempt the reckoning. Even then, it didn't last. Empress Taytu outlived most of what she had built. After Menelik suffered a series of strokes beginning in 1906, she governed Ethiopia in his name, signing documents, receiving ambassadors, managing the empire he could no longer manage himself. Court rivals forced her from power in 1910. She died in 1918, in the old palace at Entoto, watching from the sidelines as the empire she had defended passed to other hands. For decades afterward, Western accounts of Adwa mentioned her in passing, if at all, the woman who tore up the treaty, the woman who commanded 5,000 soldiers and her own artillery, the woman who proposed the strategy that forced the surrender of Mekelle. A footnote. She is slowly, belatedly getting the history she earned. And Darbomida. General Vittorio Emanuele Darbomida, who had sat at that table on the evening of February 29th and told his commander that Italy would rather lose thousands of men than retreat dishonorably. He meant it. He got it. He died in a valley his map told him was passable, at the head of men who believed, because their government and their charts had told them so, that they were fighting for something real in a place they understood. Menelik recovered Darbomida's sword and scarf from the battlefield. He sent them to the general's family in Italy. No note explaining why. Just the sword, just the scarf. The acknowledgement that a brave man had died for a lie someone else told. The lie was one word. Consent instead of yichalal. Must instead of may. A single verb, swapped between languages, that required an empire to keep believing it, required an army to march into darkness on maps, drawn to match it, and cost 6,000 men their lives on ground that had never been what the paper said. The ground at Adwa didn't care what the map said. It never does.